Well, praise the Lord, saints and friends. This is Elder Adrian Hammond. Last night, I was led to speak about the current situation in the Middle East. It seems every so often we always deal with things in the Middle East. And maybe that's not just an aberration, because the Bible actually was written in the Middle East, at least in that particular area. At least the events that took place in the Bible were largely in the Middle East. I was talking last night about Iran, because some people don't really have the full picture as to why Iran is the way that it is. I spoke about how essentially how the people in Iran, we tend to think of them, we lump them in with Egyptians, Jordanians, Libyans, and so on. When the truth is that many of them, if not most of them, are Persians, or they are descended from those who made up the Persian Empire, and not really from Arabic tribes. And that could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be a reason why they've always thought of themselves as different. You have to remember, even though both countries pursue Islam really started in Saudi Arabia, that particular area. And then it spread. Iran was one of the places that essentially the faith took hold. But at the same time, the people, the Iranians proudly reached back into their heritage as Persians. So in that case, they had at some time in the past a pretty huge empire. Like the empire that with the Medes brought the Babylonian. This was actually the second Babylonian empire. There were actually two of them. The one that Nebuchadnezzar we hear about in the Bible, that's the second Babylonian empire. That empire was conquered by the Persians and the Medes. Another thing that is probably more time appropriate for us is what happened to Iranians that essentially don't like the U.S. And I would say there's at least two reasons, but one big one. And this is why we have to study our history. We must make sure that we know our history. Not just biblical history, although that's extremely important, but world history. This is where the world history becomes extremely important, because you can't understand how people are acting nowadays unless you have an idea of what took place before. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And to mainly talk about this particular country, Iran was a place where essentially they had begun to have democratic practices, but the United States did not like what the people had chose at that particular time. This is when oil was beginning to become very important. And so there was this particular person who became known as the Shah of Iran. The U.S. pretty much took out the elected leader, put in the Shah of Iran, who was actually very authoritative. He wasn't going to allow elections because he's the Shah, of course. And so therefore, essentially, he ruled with an iron boot. And there were many people who were glad that he was there. They had property, they were doing relatively well. But there were a lot of people who essentially, that he threw in jail. Some he executed, some he persecuted. And because he did that, there was a growing dissatisfaction with him. But they didn't have the power to overthrow him until the Ayatollah Khomeini, the original one, who was in exile at the time, began calling for freedom of the people. And they began to protest, not just against the Shah of Iran, but against the country that set him up, the United States. And so the protests became so prevalent, the move became so popular, that the Shah of Iran had to flee before he ended up getting himself arrested and possibly killed. And when the Ayatollah came in, he promised, we're going back to the original roots of Islam. This is how we're going to do it. And when you compare it to what was going on with the Shah, there was favoritism. There was a lot of giving to the West. That's why the U.S. really tried to support the Shah of Iran. This is also in the time that they had captured the American embassy and held those people hostage under Jimmy Carter. But you see how anti-American sentiment grew because of who the Americans had chose to lead the Iranian people. And they didn't like that. Now, of course, after the Shah of Iran left, there were also people who kind of could read the tea leaves, so to speak, and they left. Many of them fled to the United States. And so that's why it's a pretty sizable Iranian contingent that's been in this country for years now. I mean, at least as long as the Shah has been gone. But with every American attempt to try to influence countries in the Middle East, the Ayatollahs, their message of let's get them out of here, let's be antagonistic against the Western powers, especially the United States, it became more and more entrenched because they could see what the U.S. had done. And in their, because let's be honest, the United States, for all of its ideas of democracy, and it sounds good, but unless you were a candidate that was according to their own, that catered to the U.S., then most likely that particular candidate was somehow moved out the way, either through covert actions with the CIA or overt actions like with the overthrow. We also have to look at recent history, and we have to think about that in terms of why we're in a position where it's very touch and go. Not saying that the death of the Ayatollah can't be construed as how to relieve people from their, we'll call it, from their sense of destruction, their sense of persecution, their sense of being stymied due to the harshness of the regime as portrayed by the Ayatollahs. But I seem to remember that the U.S. was also instrumental in what took place in the neighboring country of Iraq, and how, because of this fear of weapons of mass destruction, I wonder if any of you remember that the government at that time, our government at that time, they saying that Iraq was they were hiding weapons of mass destruction. Didn't know if it was nuclear, didn't know if it was chemical, didn't know if it was biological, but it was weapons of mass destruction. And it kept being said all the time until all America, especially after what happened on September 11th of 2001. Of course, many of you know that is 9/11, when two airplanes, jet planes, hit the towers, the World Trade Center towers, and brought them all crashing down. We were still in the throes of that patriotic duty to avenge ourselves of these horrible people, and how Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, how he was one of the masterminds behind this. And he has weapons of mass destruction. So because of that fear, we were then sucked into a war. The second war, actually, with Iraq. Some people say it was because the older Bush didn't get his objectives. The younger Bush wanted to continue what his father had started. And eventually Saddam Hussein was deposed, captured, killed. But in that power vacuum rose another threat that essentially began hitting Western countries, Western interests in the Middle East, even threatened our shores for a little bit. That was, of course, ISIS. In that vacuum of power, ISIS rose. And as ISIS rose, then we had to recruit people, different countries, nations, peoples. That's where we dealt with the Kurds and everything else, to try to beat that growing movement back, to conquer, so to speak, their caliphate. Eventually, that happened both during the years of Barack Obama and during the years of Donald Trump. They beat it back. So what I'm looking now with the death of the Ayatollah and some members of the highest ranking officers or officials, we have to be careful now that the same thing that happened in Iraq doesn't happen in Iran. Because there are several differences. One, Iran is bigger and stronger than Iraq. Number two, the Iraqis, it was never proven that the Iraqis had at any time weapons of mass destruction. The same thing may not be said of the Iranians. Not to mention that this is yet another example, in some people's eyes, of the Americans coming in, taking what they want, and essentially leaving the Middle East as another explosive area. The key is, have we learned our lesson from past history? Or are we doomed to do the same things we've done before? Which, again, will lead to unrest. And it's not, of course, it's not just all Iran. You have the growing power of Saudi Arabia as they hook up themselves with U.S. interests. You have Israel flexing its muscles and going after targets. And I'll talk about Israel next, possibly tomorrow. But the one thing I want us to understand regarding Iran is that whether they are people that are cheering for the death of the Ayatollah, and there's many that are, especially those who had to flee Iran, and we should be very blunt about it. The Iranians were actually repressed because of the policies of the Ayatollahs. But at the same time, when you remove someone that's been in power, good or bad, often that leaves a power vacuum, and you may never know what becomes of that. We did it once, at least, with Iraq, and that led to years of fighting against new forms and new purveyors of terrorism. Are we going to go in that position again? Are we going to do it again? We have to ask ourselves that. But just know that whatever takes place, that it will end up feeding into prophecy. One way it may push it back some, one way it may usher it in, but it's going to happen. The question is, saints of God, are you ready for whatever takes place in the Middle East? Regardless of which side you're on. Think about it. God bless you, and take care of yourselves. In Jesus' name.